Hey everybody, Matthew here again. I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about something that I alluded to, but I never really explicitly mentioned in the last video directly. So that would be prescriptivism versus descriptivism in linguistics. So what exactly does that mean now? There are two major approaches to studying language. One would be prescriptivist, and one would be descriptivist. In my last video, when I talked about the first modern people to kind of discuss the history of language and the origins, and I mentioned something called grammarians. Not necessarily every grammarian is prescriptivist, and not every prescriptivist necessarily a grammarian. So, as the name suggests, prescriptivists prescribe or explain how language should be taught or how language should be spoken or written, what rules a language should follow. Is there something innately wrong with that? No, not necessarily. But for the most part, linguists, as I mentioned in my last video, discuss different fields and subfields of linguistics. Generally, they follow a more descriptivist approach. So a descriptivist would be someone who more or less describes how the language is actually being used by its speakers. So as compared to prescriptivists who are saying how language should be spoken or are describing or explaining the rules of the language and how it would ideally be spoken, a descriptivist would say, well, that's fine and good, but these are actually the ways that people are talking. And something that I failed to mention in my last video, a language's grammar is not just what you think of as the sentence structure, but it's a combination of the phonetics and phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics of the language. A linguist would call a language's grammar. So a descriptivist would say, well, this group of people speaking this language have this rule where they are allowed to say, he ain't so-and-so. But a prescriptivist would say, well, this language doesn't have that, or it shouldn't be spoken. Is there anything innately wrong with being a prescriptivist? No, not necessarily. Such as language instruction. How are you going to teach the language? What rules are you going to use to get whether they're children or adults, whether it's the first language, second language, so on and so forth. How are they going to learn the language? Well, that's a situation where you can make a claim or make an argument that a prescriptivist mentality is useful in that you have specific guidelines. Maybe guidelines are better than a straight or a hard and fast rule. The issue, though, more than anything, is that language is a living, breathing entity. Well, maybe it doesn't breathe per se, although you breathe when you speak, but language is much like an animal. It's constantly evolving, they're constantly changing, they're adapting. Languages don't exist in vacuums. The biggest thing is languages have influence from other languages. So in a world that's increasingly globalized, that we have contact with other groups, other cultures, other languages, it's inevitable that things change. In English alone, there are so many foreign or not necessarily foreign words, but words of foreign origin that have become a part of the English lexicon. So when you say something like kayak, that's a word that originally comes from an Amerindian language. Same thing with tomato. It comes directly to English from Spanish, but that in turn came from one of the Aztec languages. So how can you really limit what is and what isn't a language? It's very difficult. If you're looking specifically at English again, you can make a claim that the English spoken today, even in Britain, is not the same as it was spoken in Britain 300 or 400 years ago. Pronunciations change, grammatical, syntactical rules sometimes occasionally change, and as a result, the language modifies, and in the future, it's inevitably going to change further. A lot of people don't understand English spelling rules, spelling conventions, because the language has changed so much that the spelling no longer the orthography or spelling no longer reflects the true pronunciation than in other languages where the orthography perhaps represents the pronunciation in a slightly more accurate way. But take words that have a silent K at the beginning. Night used to be pronounced. It used to be kneit, knife, or knicht, perhaps. Knif, knif, knife, silent E also. What happened was, over time, people, for simplification, language is all about simplification. If you study historical linguistics, comparative linguistics, sociolinguistics, the human body wants to do what's easiest for it. It's more efficient. If you're talking to somebody, it's whatever's quicker, whatever's easier to get the communication across is going to prevail. So kn is a consonant cluster, meaning it's a group of consonants that are perhaps not the easiest to pronounce. A lot of times you drop one of the elements to make it easier. So between kneit or knicht to kneit to night, what's easier? Night. That's really how the languages operate. So if more and more people are going to adopt newer rules that make language, again, even easier, it's not something that you can necessarily say is wrong, since that's what language has been doing for all these years since language has started to be spoken. So as a linguist, specifically as a sociolinguist, you have to be very, very understanding of the fact that people do make judgments on language, and that's part of how language works. Not necessarily saying that this is right or this is wrong, although that's certainly an element. Understanding how people feel when speaking a language, when hearing other people speak the same language, whether it's a different dialect or variety, whether it's a different language entirely, those are important judgments that we all make because language is constantly around us. And within my specialization in sociolinguistics, you learn that without those judgments, people don't necessarily have a reason to speak one way or another if there weren't any values associated with specific language use. So that's it for this video. Thanks again for checking it out. Again, if there's any questions or comments, please feel free to write something down below, and I'll do my best to answer it in a timely manner. If you haven't already checked out my video doing the accent tag for the East Coast, feel free to check that out also. The link will be provided. And subscribe if you're interested in hearing more videos on linguistics and language issues. And always likes are a big plus. And you can also check out my Facebook page if you're on Facebook. It's MatthewJohnHodoto.com. Feel free. I always post updates for my YouTube through there, as well as additional pages I come across that are interesting. So check it out, and I'll see you later, I guess. So that's it. Bye.